Good evening, everybody. We're running a few minutes behind time, so we will make a start. A few others might be joining us. As you can see, I am not Professor Steve McLaughlin, who's the Deputy Principal for Research and Innovation at Heriot-Watt, and he sends his apologies. He wasn't able to get back in time from another meeting he was at in the city, so he's asked me to step in for him. So my name's Jemina Napier. I'm a Professor in the School of Social Sciences, and I'm the Associate Principal for Research, Culture and People here at Heriot-Watt. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. This is the second Inaugural Impact Programme Special Lecture Panel. For those of you, some of you might remember coming to the last one, which was about quantum, which was fascinating. This programme aims to enhance the visibility and impact of Heriot-Watt's newest professors so that they can communicate how their research and their teaching expertise changes the world, and of course also allows us to celebrate their huge achievement in becoming a professor. The programme offers staff, students and the public the opportunity to engage with our academic leaders' research and teaching expertise in a number of different ways. So today, this special lecture panel features three of our newest professors in the university. Firstly, from our School of Social Sciences, Professors Arnab, Bhattacharjee, and also Eoin McLaughlin, and also from the School of Maths and Computer Sciences, Professor Catherine Donnelly. And they're going to be talking on the topic, how can we predict the future to better understand and manage future risk? So perhaps they're taking a bit of a risk themselves in being here to give us an insight into this hugely varied topic. They've only got 15 minutes each, so it's quite a challenge for them. The panel will be facilitated by journalist David Lee, who's a former senior assistant editor at the Scotsman. So he'll be facilitating the panel and taking questions from the audience at the end, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of interactive discussion at the end. Before I hand over to David to take charge of the event, I would like to take the opportunity to say get well soon to Professor Reza Kouhi. Reza was actually scheduled to be a panellist today, but unfortunately he wasn't able to make it because he's not feeling well enough. So we send him our best regards, and also to thank Eoin for stepping in at very late notice to join the panel. Arnab and Catherine on the panel today. So please welcome me in joining David Lee, who's going to guide us through our expectations for the panel today. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much indeed, Jemina, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be involved in this second lecture panel. As Jemina said, we had an event here a couple of weeks ago on quantum, which was absolutely fascinating, a little bit mind-boggling. I can get my head around risk a bit more than I could get my head around quantum, but I am sure that our contributors tonight will be equally excellent. We've also been involved in doing a couple of podcasts for the university, which are fantastic as well and should be released soon. And what we're really trying to do here with the events like this and the podcasts is just try and reflect the different way that people want to consume information now. And this has been recorded tonight. There's an opportunity to see this, an opportunity to listen to the podcasts, and just to try and get across the impact of the research that's going on, the excellent research that's going on at Heriot-Watt in a range of different ways. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we begin. You can all see where the fire exits are. There is no fire alarm planned. You know where the toilets are out and to the right, and there will be refreshments served after the event. If at any point you can't hear what's going on, if you can't hear one of the speakers and you're near the back, just wave your arms vigorously, please, and let us know, and we will try and get the speaker to get nearer to the mic just to make sure that everyone can hear. There'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions later on, and one of these box mics at the front will be thrown aggressively at you across the room, so you can ask your question. What's going to happen is quite simple. Each of our professors will speak for about 15 minutes on their research areas, and then we'll move into a panel discussion probably for about half an hour or so to develop some of their specific themes and some themes around risk that cut across what they're all talking about. So you're not here to hear from me, so I will shut up, and can you please join me in welcoming our first contributor tonight, Professor Arnab Bhattacharjee. Arnab.
Thank you. Right. Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Jemina. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Well, let me get rid of this. I am not quite a newbie, as you are going to find out soon, in this university at Leicester. So I've been here since 2013, and what I'm going to do is take my take on how we understand predicting the future and better understand and manage risk. But it's going to be maybe a slightly different take. So let me go on with it. I think in some ways, one of the fundamental questions is, well, should we try to predict or not to predict? And that is not so much set in stone as one might think. If you look back in history, and here I'm looking at Nostradamus, and wonderful predictor, predicted a lot of things. But apparently, most of this was accomplished through divine power and inspiration. And so we are relative mortal people, so how do we expect to predict? I would even go so far as to say that economics as a discipline is not really in the business of prediction. Predicting the future is not what we do. Or even other social sciences. What we do is projections. And these projections are different from prediction in the sense that the projections are calibrated to different underlying economic or social conditions, right? So these are really like scenarios. So we build scenarios. Through our theory, through our work, we build scenarios. What kind of scenarios and what kind of contexts are we looking at? Well, disasters, the COVID disaster, for example, or tsunamis, wars, so on and so forth, economic shocks, supply and demand shocks of various kinds, even and policy shocks. Policies are also shocks, because often policy is most effective when it comes as a surprise. And there is an element of surprise in policy typically. And so, where does risk and uncertainty come in? All of these entail uncertainty about the future, about the present as well, even how we look at the future or the past. And so hence, risk is very much inherent in what we do, even though in economics in particular, we are not really interested most of the time in predicting the future as is. So what does economics do? Well, what economics does, I'm a professor of economics, we do optimal decision making under uncertainty. And that is what our central job is, in a way. That is one of the central objects of economics. So let me now say how we take this forward. And so in order to do that, and keeping with the impact theme, I think this is not the only view in the world, but in my view, what you need for impact are two important things. Societal impact, you need, first of all, world-leading research or knowledge, together with knowledge exchange. So you exchange that knowledge with, participants in society. And the two need to come together. If they do not come together, you do not get to generate impact. Maybe you generate impact, but that is not out of your own research. That is out of somebody else's research. Now, in Heriot-Watt, in particular, I think in the area that I work in, we were very fortunate to have been in a situation where we were one of the world-leading knowledge creation centers. We produced one of the world-leading knowledge creation centers. This guy here, which no longer exists here, but this is the Spatial Economics and Econometrics Center. And where it created knowledge was in three areas. One was what we call business cycle in the cross-section. What that means, essentially, is that as the macroeconomy moves along, how do individual agents behave differently? And that is what we try to understand. This is somewhat different from micro-founded macroeconomics, right? Which puts the agency upon microeconomics first. That's number one. Secondly, we build structural models, structural or causal models, but for the social sciences. So that takes these shocks, these disasters, economic and policy shocks, seriously into account in trying and building counterfactuals, including in big data or machine learning settings. So that is what we do. And the third one is, happily, also spatial and network context, particularly in Britain, on the UK's regions, households, and well-being. Now, this has, as a result of this pool of knowledge concentrated here, managed to, I think, deliver quite a bit of impact on various things. Here are some examples on the Scottish Government protocol for defining local area for environmental risk assessment. And Cornelius here will be well aware of our work in that area, being in the Scottish Government at that time and commissioning some of this work, right? And they made in Scotland in particular. The Treaty of Valladolid, 2008, between Portugal and Spain. Again, that was about counterfactuals. That was about trying to think, how do you reverse depopulation in interior areas of Spain and Portugal? And that has relevance to Scotland as well. Today, I'm going to talk mostly about National Institute of Economic and Social Research, where I have been involved in policy research over the last several years, regional and distributional projections, UK Gambling Commission, Treasury, the Trussell Trust, in particular food banks and destitution. This is a gamut of various kinds of impacts that we have created, and I'm only going to pick up a little bit of the work that we are doing with the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Now, in that domain, where do we come from? So in 2020, early 2020, suddenly, COVID pandemic struck us. And immediately there was a bit of panic in the policy circles in the country because we did not, we thought, have the necessary tools to try and understand how the impacts, COVID and then Brexit came along as well. Of course, we know that it has substantial impacts upon distributions, but what are those impacts? Who does it affect? How can policy mitigate some of these? And so understanding this became extremely, extremely important. Now, what we did at the National Institute, and we were commissioned to do that, was to deliver a model, regional and distributional model, which tries to understand this on the basis of the foundational research that we have done here, right? So we're already on the frontier, so that knowledge was resident. So this combines three different elements. These are fairly technical, but I'm not going to go into those. So structural, regional, macroeconomics, spatial econometrics, and heterogeneous agents, so microsimulation. So three things we put together into a model, which we call the National Institute Regional Modeling System, NIREMS. And in the next few slides, I'm going to show you some examples of what came out of this, right? Okay, so first of all, just to say that this has been hugely influential in Britain, at least, also abroad, but in Britain particularly with a lot of interest in different areas. So these are just some of the examples of things, so Euronews here, GB News. We do not take, place value on who wants to hear us, right? Okay, so that's fine, and here is an interesting one. I'm quite proud of this because I participated in an event in Stormont, actually, when Stormont was closed, speaking to business people in Northern Ireland, trying to find out whether the business community or how the business community can come and encourage politicians to go back into their work. So that was a meeting at Stormont. And this one is Ben Chu. Ben Chu is one of the senior-most economics editors of BBC and some of his writings. So anyway, so that, just to give you some idea of what we do or what comes out of this research. Of course, it is on the domain of counterfactuals, right? So most of the future has not happened. Under different scenarios, we try to project what might happen. And here are projections of the impact of COVID and Brexit shocks compared to no shocks, right? So that is where the counterfactual is, right? In destitution, and destitution being severe lack of resources to cover for essential expenses, food, clothing, shelter, so on and so forth, energy, so on, right? Okay? Of households in Britain for 2020 and 2022. And so just a sense of what kind of things that we get. The pictures are sort of regular, right? So this is what we expect across Britain, right? So here you can see that the Northwest in particular was very severely affected by, in terms of distribution. What else do we do? This one is interesting, maybe a slightly more technical. And what we are doing here is we are looking at distribution of consumption across households in Britain across 3 different scenarios. So the red one here is the as-is scenario, so that is real life. Okay? The black one is a scenario that would have emerged if there was no COVID shock, and we are taking this for 2022, 23, and this is a picture as of November 21. Okay. In November 21, the government had taken a view that actually they were going to terminate the universal credit, the 20-pound uplift in universal credit that was being provided to very poor households, right? Okay. So what do we observe? We observe that across the entire distribution, consumption moves to the left, which means everybody has lower consumption. Ceteris paribus. Fine. That is well taken. Where is the impact the highest? In this region A and in this region B. What is this region A? So these are relatively well-off households who are accumulating lockdown savings. Fine. Good. Okay? Maybe they use some of the savings later on when the cost of living crisis hit. Good. The problem is really this region B, where poorer households, their consumption is being constricted, is being severely squashed. And if the universal credit uplift would have continued at that point, what impact would it have had? It would have taken out about half of the effect of this COVID shock. And so this is kind of the example of what we do in this kinds of policy scenarios, which is what generates this impact in principle upon society, press, and so on and so forth. Another example, this is about unsecured debt. This is more recent, right? So as a result of the cost of living crisis, debt has been increasing, but particularly unsecured debt has been going through the roof. And these are debt at very high levels of interest. So this is the as-is scenario of how this unsecured debt is distributed. And these are projections based on our models as to how this would land in the future as time goes on. Happy to answer questions later on, but just to continue with a couple more of these examples, if I have time, David?
A couple of minutes.
Yep. No, so I'll take less than that, I think. So this is interesting. This is in the budget of 2022 and the scenario taken at that point as to what the cost of living crisis means for households across the income distribution. From the left, we have the poorest decile, and the right, we have the richest decile. And you can see that the biggest effect actually is not so much of inflation, but what also comes as a result of inflation, which is relatively low wage growth. So wage growth not keeping up with inflation. All right, so inflation is very high, wage growth is low. So in relative terms, these households at the end are very much poorer. On top of that, there's the effect of inflation, right? And there's the effect of policy. So by and large, policy is actually progressive, it's redistributive. But it just doesn't cover for the huge losses of income that lower income households have faced. But not only that, it doesn't cover for the losses almost up to the median of the distribution. And that is very severe. So half of the population have actually suffered immensely because of the cost of living crisis. So these are kinds of scenarios that we can provide to politicians, to policymakers, and so on and so forth through our models. Finally, this is a bit of a fun one. This is Northern Ireland with and without the protocol. Again, it's about the counterfactuals. There are 3 graphs here, or 3 lines here. This one, the maroon one, is the UK as a whole. So this is relative to 2020, all right? Okay, so this is growth in gross value added. So gross value added or output relative to 2020, okay? And if Northern Ireland, if there was no protocol in Northern Ireland, so one of the surprises which came along was that the Northern Irish economy actually grew faster than the UK economy, right? And so you can see that in the dotted line here, right? It grew faster, okay? Quite a bit faster. Good. What would have happened if the Northern Ireland Protocol was not there? It would have been slightly lower than the UK scenario. All right, but let us put it in context. There's London here, but note that London is on the right-hand scale, which is about 4 times as high. All right, so that is the degree of disparity, spatial disparity in the country. And these are kinds of ways that we put across our impact over to society, taking account of risk and uncertainty. Of course, future is uncertain, and there are risks involved, various kinds of risks, but not really doing predictions. That is not our job. What we do is projections under counterfactual alternate scenarios. That's what, in my view at least, economics does. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Professor Bhattacharjee. Phrases you don't expect to hear. Here's a fun one on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Didn't expect to hear that today. And thank you very much for the mention of Nostradamus. The professor did confirm that he is indeed a mere mortal, but whether any of the other professors at Heriot-Watt channel the spirit of Nostradamus and use the power of divine power and inspiration, I'll let you be the judge of that. So thank you very much, Arnab. Some great thought-provoking comments there. And as he said, we will have time for questions at the end. But now I will welcome our second speaker, Professor Eoin McLaughlin. So Eoin, over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much for inviting me. I'm sorry Reza can't be here, but hopefully I can do a decent job. So how can we predict the future to understand and manage risk? It's a good question. So word or who I am, kind of introduction. So last week I was teaching economic history and trying to get the class to stay in the class because they could. Oh yeah, sure. So so I used Donnelly, right? So just put in economic history, and you get this brilliant picture. So that's that one there. So it's economic history is all about technology. The guy is a robot. He and there's loads of machines and stuff. And then I asked him what is economic history, and I think that's probably going to be like most people after they take economic history is like, oh, what was that? So going back to the question, how can we predict the future? I don't know. But I'll start off because I thought, oh, you know what? I can probably talk a little bit to the theme. So the first thing is so how do we actually measure the economy? And one of the most commonly used indicators is GDP, right? Gross domestic product. It's supposed to measure the output of an economy or the income. I just got like 2 recent headlines. I literally just put GDP into Google News, give me something. So Britain is no longer an economic outlier after the ONS found a few billion down the back of the sofa, and they were really happy about that. But it turns out all the other European countries found a few billion as well. So I think it's back to where it was. Oops. And then like the other one is China, right? So China to place well-being above GDP amid climate threat. What does that mean? Yeah. So this is all a debate about how we should measure the economy, thinking forward, right? So future risk. So there's a debate. I'm not a degrowth person, so that's one aspect to it. But there's another debate amongst economists, and this is the 2021 Scotsman Review's good illustration, how we should move away from thinking about the economy as just our GDP, which is our income, but look at the assets underpinning this. So think about our wealth. So what happens to wealth? So the Scotsman Review argued, if we want to judge whether the path of economic development to choose is sustainable, we should adopt a different system, basically, a system of wealth accounts. And so I'll try and illustrate why that's important. Now, they're not the only ones, and it's not recent, right? So the World Bank has been trying to push this since about 1997, and many people don't know about it, and that's how successful they've been. But this is the latest report, and they're going to make periodic updates of this. So this is called the Changing Wealth of Nations. They're really, going back to Smith, right? Because this is Adam Smith. Where's the wealth of nations? It's our capital. So it's our wealth, not our income. Smith doesn't talk about income, right? So it's trying to bring us back to basics. And they argue that we should be focusing on the change in wealth per capita, because this can help us manage risk and uncertainty, especially in the future. So it's supposed to be a forward-looking indicator. What this measure, the signal of this indicator today should tell us something about the future. And they say in this report, this is the best indicator for the future. But they don't, it's impossible to prove that, right? Because, they're writing 2021, they're probably not going to be in the job in 2050, no skin in the game, so it doesn't matter. But can we predict the past? Can we use the same framework to predict what happened in the past? And that's what I've been doing for years. So this is an early paper. And the idea was simple. It's like, okay, if we use this framework, can we predict the past? Can we use the historical record as a training ground for this theory? And can it work? And yes, it can for various countries, UK, US, Germany, and Australia. It doesn't work for Sweden. But that's go into that. But it only works if we include a very specific measure of technological change. So this is what these things look like. It's this is the change in wealth, which is our savings, looking at savings rates or investment rates over time. And they're really good. So the idea here is, okay, if we're in 1800, can we predict what will happen in 1900? Can we predict what will happen in 2000 using this measure? And it's really good up to 100 years or more. It's not very good in the short run. For the case of Germany, it's terrible at predicting World War II. Who would have thought that was going to happen? But anyways, that's that. So then that was early one. And then this is like Arnab talked about impact. Everyone's using our world in data. Even when Trump was giving interviews during 2020, he had a whole stack of papers of graphs from our world and data. So I got onto our world and data, so that was big. But just to show the difference between this measure of saving or change in wealth and GDP, there's a big difference between the two over time. And then this is the version 2.1. So this is 1.0. This is our latest one. And the big thing we're doing here is what happens if you price carbon in different ways, or if you price it correctly? So we have a bunch of different prices. So whether or not our economic growth in the 20th century was sustainable all depends on how we put a price on our carbon emissions. So if we have no price, everything was great. The only bad times were during wars. Wars destroy capital, that's what they do. But if the price is high, and these figures, when I started this, these prices were considered to be high prices for carbon. These are now lower estimates of prices. So the higher the price of carbon, the less the 20th century looks sustainable, right? So that's one thing. So then that's one aspect of stuff I've been doing over the past few years. And the other thing is just looking at these kind of black swans, right? So these are using the past to understand these rare events. These are ones that we can't predict. These are things like, you know, you don't know when it's going to happen or what's going to happen. But when these happen, like COVID, we just lived through one, right? COVID is a black swan. We were aware that a pandemic could happen. We didn't know when it would happen, where it would happen, what the impact would be. And in these kind of situations, policymakers look to analogies. You say, well, you know, something like this happened before, can we think of something, right? And they always go back to what they learned about, usually in universities, and they go back to something that's very convenient, right? So what's the one off the shelf, the most convenient one? And what we want to do, or try and do, is go beyond these convenient analogies. Try and, you know, broaden the knowledge and try and learn from different experiences. So try and figure out, well, that might be convenient, but is that the right analogy? So I'm guilty of using 1918 as well, right? So just before lockdowns, I had this article that it's the only thing I've ever written that people have read, like, because it got like 250,000 views in a few weeks. But it was all about, you know, okay, so what happened in 1918? What can we expect? And people loved it. And we got like on loads of podcasts and radio interviews. Chris did most of it because I was busy sharing an office with a 3-year-old. But that was fun, right? But maybe that's not the right analogy. And we're really critical of our own interpretation, right? So we started this kind of what we call pandenomics. And so we incorporate this in classes now as well, right? So the reason 1918 always gets talked about is this is one of the worst pandemics in modern history. And this graph here, I was a big fan of grayscale for a while, so it's very hard to see. But the top line here is kind of death rates by age for different pandemics. So the age spans are at the bottom, age cohorts. And I'm highlighting, there's a lesser known pandemic in 1890 to 92. Actually starts in 1889, identified in St. Petersburg, and it follows the railway line all across Europe. And this is known as the Russian flu. 1918 was called the Spanish flu. And just highlighting COVID. So these are figures for Ireland using historical data. But what we find, so 1918 is at the very top here, right? That was one of the worst and it has this W-shaped distribution. This is just for influenza deaths. If I do this for excess mortality, you see like slightly different picture. But the idea here is that was the worst case. It has this unusual distribution. It's W-shaped. There's no real good answer. Why was it W-shaped? And why the other ones, it's known as a J-shape, right? So 1890, under 10, slightly raised mortality rates. People in the prime of their lives, like mortality rates were very low. And then it increases for elderly population. And if you do this for excess mortality, you see the same picture for these other pandemics and for COVID. 1918 just sticks out as an outlier. It was during World War I, right? It's at the end of World War I. It's at a very unusual period. It's like 2 catastrophic events back to back. We shouldn't really be basing policy on something like that. It's also an era before people knew what the illness was. Like people thought it was a bacteria, but it's a virus, right? So they didn't know. So it's a really bad thing to be basing policy on. COVID response was based on this. So that's kind of like what I want to try and get away from these convenient analogies. And another thing, or why I start like being interested in pandemics is because I was interested in famines. I'm interested in these like nasty events that happen, you know, looking at these catastrophic events. So what is the health impact of severe food insecurity? So what's the long run impact of the Irish famine? Why do we care about the Irish famine? This is the worst famine in history per person terms, like relative share of population, highest excess mortality. It's one of the worst in history. So what happens to the people exposed to this famine, those that are born during this? Like, are they scarred by this, or what's going on? So my expectation starting this is what they were going to be scarred, right? So there's a German famine during World War I. And so you do see this evidence of scarring. So scarring means like you're going to be stunted as a child because if you don't have adequate nutrition. So I expected that to happen in Ireland. It's worse than that German one. That's relatively mild. But looking at Ireland, looking at different places, I kind of found counterintuitive things. If you were in the countryside, which was the most affected by this famine, you actually got taller. You didn't experience stunting. But if you were in the city, you were stunted. So that was counterintuitive. But this is kind of can make sense if you're aware of the demography literature, that there's a thing called selection, right? So if you're in the most affected area, and if you survive, and if you get to adulthood, you're a very selected population, and like kind of survival of the fittest almost, right? So that's kind of another thing to look at. So understanding the dynamics of famines and how they what is the long run impact as well, because it's been predicted with climate change that we might have increased food insecurity in the future. And then this is from last year. So when the war broke out in Ukraine, Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world, right? So then what can we learn from past pandemics? And when we pitched this idea to the conversation, it was all about, well, Ukraine, the last time Russia did something like this to Ukraine, they had this massive famine in Ukraine. What can we learn from that? What can we learn from how to deal with the fallout? And at the time, food prices were rising, but thankfully things haven't come to that kind of worst case scenario. And then just to finish this out, one of the reasons I was in Scotland before I joined Heriot-Watt. I joined Heriot-Watt just the start of this year. I was in Ireland before that in UCC, and then I was before that at St Andrews. But one of the things when I first came to Scotland was in IndieRef, like the first IndieRef. And I was surprised why Scotland never talked about Ireland. So Alex Salmond had always talked about Ireland as a great example of independence up until 2007-8, when something happened in Ireland. I don't know what happened in Ireland that year. Anyways, we don't talk about that anymore because we're out of the bailout phase. It doesn't matter anymore. Anyway, it wasn't mentioned, but I was like, come on, that's the most obvious thing you could talk about if you're Scotland. Who else left the United Kingdom? Ireland. It's the only example you can think of, right? Well, that's what I thought. But it did get, so I got a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship to look at this, and I called it Ireland's Messy Divorce. The slight difference, I guess, is a little bit of violence that took place in Ireland, but the mechanics of the whole institutional change are very similar. Like, how do you allocate debt? What's the currency you use? These are very relevant questions for Scotland. How are pensions distributed? All this kind of stuff. So when I was doing it, it got a write-up in The Economist in 2014. A lot of my findings weren't really positive, I'd say, for independence, early independence. But it's still relevant. You can still learn from it. So some of the big lessons then were, how do you allocate debt after independence? And there was a really nice kind of natural experiment, right? Because Ireland didn't have its own borrowing powers before independence, but there were specific government bonds issued just for stuff in Ireland, and they were called land bonds, or at the time derogatively known as bog stock, because it's guaranteed by land in Ireland. But the idea I had before I started was okay, let's look at this and see how markets react to the independence events, right? So track these bonds going back to when they're first issued. And there is a little bit of volatility around the independence debate, but the more interesting thing that we found was what happens after independence, because these bonds, they are backed by the security of the land, basically. They're issued to finance land reform. All farms were effectively bought out, so there was state-issued mortgages. The only place in the United Kingdom that this happened. So it's still kind of a policy relevant for land reform discussion in Scotland as well, if you want to finance land reform. But the other thing was about this idea of debt mutualization, because the only thing that happened, or quite irrelevant, was this guarantee that the British government had issued. And after when Ireland became independent, there was a big doubt over, well, how is this guarantee going to be honoured, or who's going to honour the guarantee? And we found a natural experiment, because Ireland said, we're going to default in 1932. And so on this graph here, the black line is just regular UK bonds. The land bonds always have a premium. And then there's Irish government bonds always have a premium above that. And what's interesting in 1932, up until this point, there was a lot of uncertainty. Well, who's going to guarantee these things? Like if the music stops at the party, who has to foot the bill? And bang on 1932, just before the default happened, the Treasury issued a note saying, we will guarantee these bonds. And as soon as they did that, the premium vanished. So it was pretty much considered to be the same as. And the nice thing was that there was, post-independence, the Irish government had issued new bonds, and they guaranteed their bonds, and they didn't see the same kind of effect. So these issues are relevant then for other stuff like in the Eurozone, if they want to do debt mutualization. There's all this uncertainty, but this shows uncertainty can be resolved with clear statements from policymakers. And I think this is my last slide, just like what's the relevance for, I don't think there's going to be any IndyRef 2 anytime soon, but if there was, there's loads of lessons. I didn't write the headline for this because it said the editor that I was working with, he was a Scottish guy and he wasn't very keen on IndyRef 2, so he added it won't control interest rates and inequality will widen. But it's kind of true, but that's not necessarily what we were getting at. So it doesn't reflect the arguments we were making, but still got a lot of hate for that one. So that's the end of that, I think. Cool.
Thanks very much indeed, Eoin. The word bog stock stuck in my head now. It just sounds like a really, really terrible festival. But again, some fascinating lessons from history there and some fantastic commentary on risk. And we'll now move over to our final of our third speakers, Professor Catherine Donnelly, who is, say, from a different school, is coming at this from a slightly different perspective, but again, another fascinating take on risk. So, Catherine, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, David. So yeah, I've been very interested to hear Arnab and Eoin talking as well. So I may be going a little bit of a tangent on my work. So I just want to give you a bit of a flavour about my very much topic of interest. So it's about pensions. And so I think we're basically facing a kind of pension crisis, particularly in the UK, with regards to how are you going to get an income in retirement. So the two main choices we have in retirement are not suitable for many people for different reasons. So I'm just going to start with some motivation and then sort of try to lead you down the path of the kind of things I look at. Okay, so this is the current UK situation in regards to pensions, right? So in about 2011, the government announced automatic enrolment. So the idea in the UK is that people are now saving for their retirement. So if you think about the pension system in the UK, so most people will have probably most people here will have a basic state pension when they retire, which is about £8,000 a year if you have your full entitlement. But for most people, about £8,000 a year isn't enough to maintain their standard of living. Most people, again, are not in what we call a defined benefit pension scheme. So probably many people in this room are because you're in USS. But for the most people in the UK who are not in the university sector, they're not going to get defined benefit pension scheme income, right? So in a defined benefit pension scheme income, you know what you're going to get in retirement in terms of your income from that pension scheme, right? Normally expressed in terms of your salary, but you'll know what that is. But most people do not have that. Most people are now saving into what we call defined contribution pension schemes. And these are effectively a kind of glorified savings investment scheme with tax advantages. So in a defined contribution scheme, you put money into this savings investment contract. You typically take the default investment choice because you don't know what else to do. And then at retirement, you're supposed to do something with this money to get an income. Now we can see, so just before we get to there, so it used to be the case that when you retired with a defined contribution pension savings amount, whatever amount of money that was, you had to buy a life annuity. But since 2015, you no longer have to. So you've got a choice about what you do with that money, something called pension freedom. And the government announced pension freedom. It was a huge shock to the pension and insurance industry because they had no warning of it. And the government did give a lot more, like literally freedom to people in terms of what you do with your pension savings. And they were expecting an innovation from industry, but we really haven't yet seen that innovation arising. But what we do have is millions of people saving into this workplace pension, and there's billions and billions of pounds going into it, right? And even though it's a lot of money, in an individual level, it might not be so much. Okay, so let's say you have just retired and you've saved up, could be, let's say, £100,000 into your DC pension pot, your defined contribution pension pot, and you would like an income from retirement from it. So most people do not go to a financial advisor. They'll ask their friends, family, they'll look online for what to do. And if they look online, there is some government help online. This service called PensionWise, that you can also phone people up for free and they'll give you advice. But there are two main options. So one is called a life annuity and the other is called income drawdown. So in a life annuity, you take your £100,000 and you could give it to an insurance company, and in return they say, we will guarantee to pay you £7,000 a year until you die, whenever that is, guaranteed. So you don't have to think about it anymore, you just give them £100,000 and every month you'll get a known income into your bank account. However, not so many people are buying that option, right? So I think until about last year, it was about 10% of people who were retiring with a defined contribution pension pot were buying a life annuity. It's gone up a bit because interest rates have gone up, which has meant that you get more income for your £100,000 than before. But still, many people are not buying it, right, for various reasons, which we won't go into. The other option is what's called income drawdown, where you just continue to invest your money and you withdraw an income from it, right? But that involves a lot of choices, right? So you have to think about, how will I invest my money, right? So how are you going to invest your money? I can't answer that. Like for myself, I couldn't answer it. And you also have to think about, how long am I going to live for? Are you going to live to 90, 95, 85, right? What are you going to guess for how long you're going to live for, right? So there's lots of things you have to think about. You might think about inflation, right? I'm worried about inflation because particularly in the last year or so, we've had high inflation. You know, that's much more in people's mind than it would have been really in the last 10 years. The other thing with income drawdown is that because you have to decide all these things, not because of the decision, but basically you don't know how long you're going to live for, you don't know how you should invest, you're bearing a lot of risk on yourself. And there's a risk that either you run out of money in retirement, or there's a risk that you're so worried about running out of money, you don't withdraw as much as you could be withdrawing. So you lower your standard of living because you're so worried about running out of money. So what I've been working on are pension schemes to try and find a kind of third way between income drawdown and life annuities. And what these pension schemes do is they try to pull what I'll call the longevity risk of the people. So you don't have to guess how long you're going to live for because you're pulling that risk with other people. And this should lead to a higher, I'll say, expected income. So that will mean different things to different people in the audience, but higher expected income than under a life annuity and under income drawdown, right? But we'll just look at this as we go through here. So yes, I'm going to introduce some risk here. So just to give you an idea of this. So here we're looking at a graph showing you just very sort of high level. On the x-axis, we have increasing investment risk borne by the person who's retiring, the retiree, and on the y-axis, increasing longevity risk. That can be interpreted very broadly as the risk that you're running out of money or the risk that you don't withdraw enough money because you're so worried about that risk. So in income drawdown, where you continue to invest your money and you just withdraw an income when you like, you bear all of your longevity risk, right? So you have to guess how long you're going to live for, and you can choose how much investment risk you bear, right? So you can choose, do you want to invest in low risk bonds or higher risk equities or go for something even riskier? You can choose that. With life annuities, you're removing, in most cases, you're removing all of those risks with a life annuity. So with a life annuity, you give your £100,000 to the insurance company, and in exchange, they say, guarantee you £7,000 for life, right? So they worry, the insurance company worries about how long you're going to live for, how to invest the money. You don't have to worry about that. But what I've been looking at is basically trying to span that gap between these two extremes, because they are two extremes. So I'm looking at structures that try to remove that longevity risk from people, and can also actually pull the, I can't say pull, but share the investment risk, really the investment returns between different groups of people, right? So some of my work I've been looking at, in particular, this Royal Mail collective pension plan. So this will probably every so often pop up in the news. So it's something called a collective defined contribution scheme, and it's very new in the UK. It's the first such one we've ever had. There's a lot of perhaps there's a direction in the pensions industry where they might not follow that particular scheme in terms of scheme design, but they're looking at decumulation only, or retirement only versions of that scheme in retirement. So what I'd like to be able to do is to be able to choose where we live on this chart, basically, right? So we're able to design schemes to meet the desired risk appetites of the people in the scheme. Now I'm going to look at a very, very simple one called a pooled annuity fund, and it's just the simplest structure you can do. Effectively, it is in some sense what's going on in a life annuity. It's just made very, very explicit, and it doesn't have any guarantees, but we could add guarantees if we want it. So why do we do this thing called pulling longevity risk, right? So what does that mean? So whenever you're pulling longevity risk, what it means is you've got a group of people, so imagine everybody in this room, you each throw in £100,000, right, into a pot in a sense, and if one of you dies, you share out that £100,000 that person put in, you share it out among everybody else in the room, right? Okay, so whenever you die, your money is going out, shared out among the others, right? And there's different ways of sharing that money out, but that's the idea. So in a sense, everybody becomes a beneficiary of each other, right? It's a kind of mutual scheme. And it seems very brutal, basically, but that's exactly what goes on in life annuity contracts. It's what goes on in defined benefit pension schemes. It's all just hidden underneath, but that's really what's going on, right? So the shorter-lived people subsidise the longer-lived people. We can say this in all different ways, and maybe not saying people dying, but that's what happens, right? And the advantage of that is that you get a much higher return for the survivors, which means to a higher income than if you didn't do that. But the quid pro quo is that whenever you die, you don't leave that money to your beneficiaries, to your heirs, right? Instead, it's going to the pool of people. Okay, so in terms of return, so maybe we don't have much time to look at this, but this is just indicating it. So this is, first of all, just your annual chance of dying according to some mortality table. Right, so on the x-axis we have age from 65 to 120. When this table ends, it assumes everybody's dead at age 120. And then we have the annual chance of dying on the y-axis. So you see it's increasing over time as our chance of dying increases. So this is just an insurance table from the insurance company data. But the interpretation of this annual chance of dying is this is your expected return due to pulling your longevity risk, right, to sharing out the funds of those who have died among the survivors. And you can see it's going up quite high over time, right? So at age 85, if you were a survivor in a pool of people, you would expect to get a return of 11% due to other people dying on top of your investment return. And this level of return, you're unlikely to be able to replicate that from investment returns. You'd be having to have a very risky strategy to do that. So this is the huge benefit you get from pulling your longevity risk with people. Now, one line of my research has just been looking at trying to pull longevity risk and not adding in complications involved with investment risk. And I call it a pooled annuity fund. There's different names in the literature and in practice, because we do see these things in practice. But the idea is that we pull our money together, retirement savings, and you can choose how much you want to pull. If you want to leave money to your beneficiaries, you can keep it out of it if you desire. But the idea is that we're trying to pay a lifelong income to people. So the idea is that people don't have to worry about how long they're going to live for and how they should invest. It's just all done for them. So that's the idea of these things. And you can get a higher, I'll say, expected income, right? So it's not a guaranteed income. We're not sure exactly what it's going to be. It can go up and down. You get a significantly higher income compared to income drawdown, right? So the benefit of pulling longevity risk is that, so just a simple example, straightforward example, that you get a 25% higher income than under income drawdown, assuming the same investment strategies, right? So if you decided to, I'm going to invest my £100,000, for example, and I'm going to assume that I'm 65, I'm going to assume I live to age 90, and I'm going to withdraw my money from just my own investment, and let's assume I get 5% return every year. So I compare the income I get to that to going into one of these pooled annuity funds where you also get a 5% investment return, but you have this survivor benefit that if you survive, you get the share of the funds of those who have died. Well, then you get a 25% higher income from this pooled annuity fund, and it'll be for life as opposed to 25 years in this income drawdown situation, right? So it's got a huge benefit. Compared to life annuities, there is a different sort of risk, definitely obvious different risk return trade-off. So in a life annuity, your income is guaranteed for sure, right? In these pooled annuity funds, the income is not guaranteed, so it can go up or down over time. If you want to try and keep it going up, even slowly or steadily, then we have to perhaps look at either an extremely low risk investment strategy or else doing investment return sharing across generations. But that's a sort of gets too complicated, but that's another work I look at. But you should get much higher income, expected income for these things compared to life annuity because you're not paying for all the guarantees in a life annuity, right? So it could be 25% to 40% higher than a life annuity. Always depends on what actually happens and so on. But there's a risk that you get less money at some time point in the future compared to life annuity. So it's not for everyone, right? So we're not saying this is a product for everyone. It's just for some people who are happy to take some risk. There are other things that people want. So you see this some very standard features. So there's like a spouse's pension. Most people want an income that will continue if they die to their spouse or partner. And so we've been looking at how to provide that. A bequest option, different ways of providing that. We can actually provide a bequest, a payment to your beneficiaries if you die. That's also possible, though effectively you're giving up some of your income for that. But with different ways of doing that, we've been investigating. Minimum guarantee on your income. This is again to do with investment strategy. So these are all things that we can look at within these structures. And so other people have also looked at them. In terms of implementation, so we could either look at this as a retail fund. So you take your £100,000 and you can invest in some fund offered through a fund platform of some sort, or it could be done through your pension scheme where you're saving in a DC pension plan, and then whenever you retire, it's offered as an option to you when you retire. Because at the minute, if you look at your DC section of USS, if you're in that, there's not really a strong push as to what you're going to do with that money when you retire. Whereas this could be offered as an almost default option. And we do see examples of this in practice. So some of them are quite new and some of them have been offered for several years, but they've all got maybe reasons why they're doing well, or we're still to find out if some of them are going to do well. Right, but one thing that is going to hamper their implementation is about who is responsible for the risk in these schemes. Right, so in a life annuity contract, the insurance company is bearing all of the risk, right? So you give them £100,000, insurance company, to buy a life annuity, and they say, we will pay you £7,000. They worry about all the investment risk, longevity risk. In income drawdown, where you invest, you have to decide how long you're going to live for and how to invest. Ostensibly, you decide how long you're going to live for, how to invest. I'm not saying it is a necessarily genuine decision people have made, because if they're not experts, I think it is a very hard decision, but they ostensibly make the decision and they bear the consequences of that decision. But in these pooled annuity funds, what happens is you're giving your money to this pooled annuity fund and they say, we expect to pay you this income, it may go up or down, and maybe this is by how much we expect it to go up or down over time. But someone is in that scheme, the manager is deciding how to invest that money. They're also deciding at what rate to pay out your income, right? And that then leads into about the predictions over time. So predictions of future investment returns, future mortality. So someone is making decisions for you, but you, the participant, are bearing all of the risk, all the consequences of their decision, right? And so this is something that has to be thought about. So this is why what's missing is that we need a proper risk management framework for the decisions about how to invest the money that people are putting into these schemes, also to do with the communication of risk to people. So this is something that I'm working on at the moment in this sphere. So just to give you a broad idea of what this particular line of work. So I will finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Catherine and to Arnab and to Eoin there for some really, really fascinating presentations. Catherine, you talked a little bit at the end there, just reflecting on what you've just said about some of the barriers and the responsibilities and who bears the risk of the kind of scheme that you're proposing. How do you assess at the moment? You're someone who's worked in the pensions industry for a few years ago. What's the relationship between the pensions industry, academia, and policymakers in terms of looking at these kind of slightly more radical approaches to funding in retirement? And what are the barriers within that relationship?
Yeah, so at the minute, I think academics are generally not in that conversation, and I think they should be, because I think particularly with these type of schemes, so the pooled annuity funds, and also I mentioned this Royal Mail type scheme, so the pensions industry is looking at, many of the sort of key people in the pensions industry and the key companies are looking at a particular decumulation only or retirement only CDC, where you're sharing investment returns and longevity risk. But a lot of them are coming from a defined benefit pension background, and in defined benefit pension schemes, the risk transfers between people in the scheme, from perhaps young people in the scheme to old people, to the first generations in the scheme, to the middle generations, to the last generations, that never had to be explored or considered, because there was always the company who was a sponsor who would just kind of make the balance right. Obviously we still have deficits, but generally they didn't have to do that, whereas it is extremely important in these schemes collective defined contribution schemes, where the participants are bearing all the consequences of decisions made by someone else. So to me, yes, academics should be involved in the sense that we come with a certain perspective of how to look at this at a generic level, but we're not in there at the moment. And so this is also what I'm trying to do, is to work with people in industry and also make connections with the regulators to try and build up the confidence as well in us and what we can do.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm just going to ask one question of Arnab and Eoin, but if anybody has got any questions, stick your hand up and we'll come to you after. Has anybody got any questions? Yeah, there's a question, Lee, there's a question just behind here. Can we get the microphone to him? I'm just going to ask, before your question, this is quite a big question actually. You've seen this story trailed a lot about, policymakers do quite unexpected things at times. So we've got the Rishi Sunak announcement this afternoon on low vehicle emissions and on boilers. How can you factor in that risk, that policymakers just doing crazy stuff and really unexpected stuff? Arnab and Eoin, either of you like to explain how you possibly factor that in? Arnab?
Right. I think that is a very important question. So I'm going to put my National Institute hat on here and say something that the National Institute says every time they go out into the public, saying that the purpose of policy must be to reduce risk, not enhance risk. Part of the problem that we have in this country, as well in lots of other places, is that the moment ministers open their mouth, they potentially increase risk or uncertainty rather than reduce it. In order for a well-functioning financial and economic system, economic agents must be able to somehow plan for the future and plan for a relatively long period in the future, whether that be for insurance or for other reasons, investments and so on and so forth. And if there is this additional risk coming in, it is very difficult for people to predict. And then, as a result of that, what happens is that policies as well do not have their intended outcomes. The Bank of England goes on raising interest rates. In some ways, people don't believe that they are going to control inflation because, it's just, not credible because, people don't see that credibility there. And so this is a huge problem that we have. And, how do we account for that? Well, actually, we do scenario analysis, right? We don't try to predict what the policymakers would do. We assume that, and under different policy scenarios, we go and say, well, this is what is then going to happen potentially, and this is what is going to happen in another scenario, and so on. Thank you.
Okay. Eoin, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so policymakers doing crazy stuff. I can think of a few good ones. So the stuff when I was working on carbon pricing, the Trump administration did something really crazy. Like they increased their preferred discount rate to. So when the Trump administration decided they didn't want to do anything for climate change, they increased their discount rate to 7%. And so basically meant that they put price of carbon at zero. And it was really and up to that point, the US had been very credible. And all of a sudden, it's incredible. So how can you adjust for that? Do you think that's not going to happen? But if you look back historically, there's loads of mavericks out there. The 1920s, 30s, Ireland, we have De Valera. He's always up to these kind of things. And it's just being aware that it's in the interest of the policymakers to do this, especially for politicians, not policymakers, right? Politicians are concerned about the electoral cycle. They're not necessarily thinking about the wider ramifications, So it's just being aware that can happen.
Okay, so I'll take the question here, then we'll come to the question here. Yeah, thank you. Who wants to go at that? Eoin, do you want to bash at that, or Arnab? Catherine?
I can. Yeah. So for my work about pension schemes, this is going to be, it is already, but more and more important in terms of measuring and managing and modelling climate change risks. So to me, this is a big topic that we need to be working on because basically in industry, there isn't the knowledge about this. So to me, this is, I'm not going to answer your question as such, but basically, yeah, this is something we must be working on. And it does require coordinated efforts of people across many disciplines and countries as well. So it is just a big urgent thing that we all need to be doing.
I want to add something, if I may, and it is not only the risk of hazards, but the bigger, one of the other areas of uncertainty is what is society going to do about that? How much is society prepared to go to potentially a lower level but sustainable level of consumption? This is something that society needs to decide. And that there is tremendous uncertainty and tremendous variation across the world in how much society is willing to do in that direction. And so that actually enhances the uncertainty in a way because, in some ways, politicians are going to work in political cycles, and these are essentially determined by elections and stuff like that. So they are relatively myopic. But what does society tolerate? How does society see these things? And society is not one society, right? Enormous diversity across the world, and it is and combine that with the geopolitical risks, then it is a very complicated scenario. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So one of the things I'm working on is catastrophic risk, global catastrophic risk or existential risk. And in that literature, climate change is not at the top, but there's other risks. And if we focus all our attention on climate change, we miss the other ones. And that's what we want to avoid doing. We don't want to just say, let's focus only on climate change. We have to be climate change, when something else can kill us all. And that's what, like, there's a really good book, Toby Orr's Precipice is all about that. And he goes through the different risks that we have, but for him and for a lot of other people, climate change isn't the top risk. It's a risk, but it's not the only risk, and don't want to be blinded to other ones.
So what's at the top of the list?
AI, Terminator.
Killer robots.
Killer robots. AI gets too smart. If the AI gets really smart and you ask AI, can you solve climate change? And AI goes, what's causing climate change? People are causing climate change. Get rid of the people, get rid of climate change. But that's a bigger risk.
We've gone quite existential here. So, sorry, we've got a question. Have you still got a question? Yes. Yeah, we'll take this question here because he's got the microphone, then we'll come to you afterwards. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, I'll just put, Eoin, I'll just ask you to comment on that, but just in addition to it, tell me if I pick this up wrong, I apologise, but you said in terms of looking like centuries back, actually that taking that long-term view was often more reliable than looking at shorter terms when you'd got obviously intervention of wars and things like that. How does that work in an age of, which you've just touched on, technology and huge technological change? Is that still relevant, or is the huge pace of technological change making that long-term forecasting less reliable?
Well, I started when doing this during the Industrial Revolution, and technology has been increasing ever since then, right? It hasn't stopped. I wouldn't even say the rate of technology has jumped astronomically. We just keep learning and learning. So the 1760s are totally different to the 1800s. 1800s is totally different to 1900s. What we're trying to predict are real wages or changes, actually even changes in kind of biological indicators like change in height or change in infant mortality. But the problem is, if you're looking at short term, you get hit by very cyclical issues, so business cycles. The longer you spread it out, you miss that. But it's really hard to predict something like as dramatic as World War II in Germany. Like, no one was, the impact on Germany is worse than anywhere else, right? Because the Soviets come in, they just literally ripped up the railways, brought them back to Russia.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll pass the microphone across to you. Sorry, Arnab briefly, and then this lady will finally get to ask your question. Yeah.
Yes, so I just wanted to highlight a little bit how we look at the past through a structural lens, at least in my work. So yes, the World War II is very hard to predict because there is a large shock involved there. But what you do is that you look through the lens of a structural causal model to identify points in the past which look like the scenarios that you are trying to project for, right? And then you identify World War II. And once you have identified World War II and see how the economies have performed, how behavior has changed around that point, that is where somehow you learn about the scenarios that you are trying to project. And this is the standard way that we take in thinking about things.
Okay, thank you very much. Question here, then we'll bring the microphone to the back as well. Yep.
So in profiteering, that's more about the study of the industry. So we can look at the life annuity industry and how people were sold life annuities earlier, and there was a lot of, let's say, behavioural things that people were doing. So if you saved with an insurance company, you're much more likely to buy their life annuity contract, and they knew that, so they wouldn't necessarily give you a good rate. There were things going on like in the Sunday newspapers, you often have the financial section, and they have this best buy rates. If you've got £100,000, this is the annuity income you can buy from the highest 5 annuity income rates you'll get from insurance companies. And some companies were giving you that rate if you had £100,000, but if you went to them with £90,000 or 110, they'd give you a different rate. So all sorts of things going on, which is really, I think, partly led to the pressure on the government to introduce pension street freedom, to say you no longer had to buy a life annuity with your income, with your pension savings in retirement. So it's kind of like the industry has somehow reaped what it sowed earlier on. In terms of women, I mean, just generally, so I don't focus on research in particular in women, but generally women are in a more vulnerable situation because of they generally have lower salary when they're working. There's the motherhood penalty. So basically women generally do have a lower amount of pension savings than men, and that's all visible in the data. So those are things I think that can be addressed in a potentially different way. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if we want to get into that now or not, but yes, I mean,
Okay,
there's
thank you.
Lots of things we could think about.
There's a lot of things being brought in here. Sorry, we've got the microphone at the back, and then can we pass the microphone. Question at the back first. That's a big question. That's an entire week-long conference. I'm going to ask you to give very brief answers to your definitions of risk. And I thought that first question was interesting. What if we don't listen to the right people? In terms of Eoin, you look like you're raring to go on this one.
Yeah, just for the first one, I was only talking about the stuff I was doing in savings rates, but I've got a good counterpoint for World War One. And there was a nice study that was like, did anyone predict World War One looking at financial markets? And there was nothing happening in financial markets that seemed like World War One was on the cards. But there were people predicting war of great powers. There was a lot of contemporaneous discussion about it, but it wasn't being reflected in the financial markets. And it's all really like, same as you, I read a lot of stuff on World War One and Two, and Netflix seems to tell me now that I should watch these documentaries. But when you go back, and there was a nice one, it was funded by the Serbian Ministry of Culture. I don't know why Serbia wants to say they didn't start World War One, but it was like they highlight all this stuff. And you're like, oh yeah, that's where World War One's going to happen, and all the things they highlighted. But even at the time, you're not putting together all these dots, right? Come to World War Two, we know, there's a lot of conflict still unresolved after World War One. But there still was a view that it could be, managed, right? That Hitler could be managed. That was the consensus until it was too late. And today there is fear that war in Ukraine could spread. Before the war, there's a lot of people saying, "Oh, Putin won't invade," and like who was going to predict that the invasion was going to happen? But there was some people saying, take it seriously. Look, he's at the border. He's ready to do it, and so. I'm not quite sure.
Arnab and Catherine, just a very brief sort of answer to the second question on what is risk, if that's possible.
Okay, so let me first of all say just half a minute on the first one. Usually, one can predict things. It is the timing that one cannot predict very precisely. I'm not even going to talk about the war in Ukraine. Was it predictable? Probably it was. But the timing was not predictable. And this is a central point, I think. And so, therefore, because we can predict some things or potential things, that is why we build scenarios for it. If we could not predict them, we wouldn't build scenarios. We cannot maybe predict the exact time. So which brings me also to the point of risk. And I think the important thing, you have your hand right on the button. It is about managing risk. Of course, risk is there. Risk is there in every activity that we undertake. Not least, sitting in an university context on managing risk in research. Research is extremely risky because we do not know what we are going to get out there. We go into it completely blind. Maybe we come out with something interesting. Maybe we don't. Should we therefore not take the risk? Who bears the risk? In some ways, it is about managing that risk. It is about diversifying and managing risk, which is the more important issue. So, for me, that is the critical point, essentially. Thank you.
We can carry this on over coffee afterwards, because it's the big questions. Catherine, just a brief comment.
I'm going to give a kind of vague answer, but yes. So in my line of work, whenever we talk about risk, we normally mean something very quantifiable that we attempt to quantify in some way. But obviously, all the qualitative or things that we can't maybe write down in a mathematical formula, they all matter so much as well. But it's just the management of them is different, basically. So that's my vague response.
Right, thank you. I am conscious of time. I do apologise to those people. I know we started slightly late. I'm just going to ask all the panellists very briefly before we summarise, just to say what's next in your research. What are you looking forward to over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of this broad issue of how your work helps manage risk? So I'll just go along the line. I'll start with you, Catherine, and come this way, and then we'll move to the summary. So what's your plan for the next 5 to 10 years? What excites you about what you do?
Yes, so basically looking at a risk management framework for these type of pension schemes. So that's a big thing, and climate change and the move to net zero. So how are we going to incorporate models of that into our predictions of the future, and how will that affect the management of these types of pension schemes? So that's a big topic for me.
Okay, Eoin.
Let me think. So one of the things I want to do cynically is write a book about the wealth of nations for 2026. So that is my most, because I think it will sell, because that's going to be 250th anniversary of Adam Smith. But in that context, I'm thinking a lot about catastrophic risk, right? So existential risk. And so that's one of my papers I'm working on at the moment, is about this theme, and that's something like I'm getting more into because I get to mix sci-fi with research. I think it's fun. So I think that excites me.
Okay, Arnab, final word.
Yeah, very quickly. So my research comes at it from 2 directions. So I have basic research or foundational research. I work on foundations. At the same time, I try to take these foundations onto impact, right? So it spans a wide range. On the impact end, I'm already doing quite a bit. I'm going to continue to do that, right? But at the foundations bit, this is what excites me most. Where I'm at the moment is trying to use big data, machine learning techniques to understand structures or causal structures. So look at big data and machine learning methods, not to predict the actual outcomes, but to predict counterfactuals under alternate scenarios. And that is a very different problem. And that is where we are going. This is not a very populated area of the literature, but we are getting there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed to Arnab, to Eoin, and to Catherine for those brilliant insights today as part of the Inaugural Impact Programme series. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm just going to hand over for a final few words to Professor Dimitris Christopoulos, who's Director of Research for the School of Social Sciences and Edinburgh Business School. Dimitris.
Thank you. I'm here to just offer votive thanks to our panelists and our chair. I represent the university in that role. I also, as a student of risk, found this fascinating tour de force by our professors here. I've learned about policy surprise, that policy should reduce risk. It's interesting. Politicians should be told that. Counterfactuals, catastrophic events by Eoin and how to frame risk around them. I have also learned about how, well, actually I wondered whether all economists espouse redistribution. What does this mean for the profession? So that's a sort of, are we all socialists? I don't know. Then, of course, when I came to the talk on, like Catherine gave, I was thinking, well, how would I navigate my own pension? Maybe I should join a longevity pool at the time of COVID. This is the time where everybody in my age group should be suffering, or maybe find some pandemic to join, or do not join with a group of individuals that might be, part of the mafia, say. I wouldn't want to be a target for anyone. So anyhow, I've learned a lot, and I reflected on our colleagues. My role here is to just say that this was very valuable, and I hope that it was true for all our audience, and to again thank the chair, and from the university, applaud the contributions of our professors. Thank you.